Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Chapter 1. My story begins. There was no chance of taking a walk that cold and rainy day. I was glad. My 3 cousins teased me during the walks. They didn't like me any more than I liked them. My name is Jane Eyre. My parents had died 10 years before, when I was just a baby. Since then, I'd lived with my aunt and her 3 children at Gateshead Hall. On this day, my cousins, John, Eliza, and Georgiana, were in the warm parlor with their mother. But I was not allowed in. Until you can behave like a good girl, you are not to come in here, Aunt Reed told me. But what have I done? I asked. Jane, I do not like children who question their elders, she snapped. I slipped into a cozy sitting room. There, I sat down to read in a window seat. But I was not safe for long. John flung open the door. He did not see me behind the window curtains. Lizzie! Georgie, he called to his sisters. Jane is not here. Tell Mama. Eliza was smarter than her brother. Jane is in the window seat, she said. I came out from the curtains at once, afraid of being dragged out by John. What do you want? I asked him. Say what do you want, Master Reed, was his answer. I want to know what you are doing. John was large and fat for a 14-year-old boy. He did not like his mother or sisters. But he liked to bully me. I was reading. I showed him the book. You have no right to take our books, John said. He snatched the book away. You have no money. You should go and beg, not live with rich folks like us. I'll teach you not to touch my books. For they are mine. Everything in this house will belong to me someday. He angrily threw the heavy book at me. I fell against the door, cutting my head. You are a wicked and cruel boy. I cried. I got up and tried to fight back. I could feel blood trickling down my neck from the cut on my head. Aunt Reed and the servants came rushing in. Ungrateful girl, my aunt said. Lock her up in the red room. My aunt's maid, Bessie, took me upstairs to the cold, dark room. You have a duty to Mrs. Reed, miss, Bessie said to me gently. If not for her, you would go to the poorhouse. This was not news to me. I had heard it many times before. Try to be useful and pleasant, Bessie went on. Otherwise, Mrs. Reed will send you away, I'm sure. She left me there, sad and lonely. It was the same room where my uncle had died, bolus 9 years earlier. Uncle Reed had been my mother's brother. When my parents died, he had taken me in. And when he was dying, he'd made his wife promise to care for me as one of her own children. I cried in the locked room for hours. I'd tried to behave. I'd tried to be good. But it didn't matter. My aunt did not love me. She only took care of me because she had to. Left alone, I cried until I fell asleep. Things got no better as the months went on. I was left out of the holiday parties. And Aunt Reed told my cousins not to spend time with me. My only friend was a small and ragged doll. And Bessie was sometimes kind. At night she brought me a treat, and she tucked me into bed with a kiss. One day, I was called into the parlor. A tall man stood there. He stared at me and then turned to my aunt. She is small. What is her age? 10 years, Aunt Reed replied. What is your name, little girl? The man asked me. Jane Eyre, sir, I said. Well, Jane, are you a good child? Aunt Reed sniffed and shook her head. The less said on that, the better. A naughty little girl is a sad sight, the man said with a sigh. Mr. Brocklehurst, Jane is a liar, Aunt Reed said. That is her biggest fault. If she goes to Lowood School, you will need to keep an eye on her. Train her to be useful and humble. And I wish her to spend all vacations there. Mr. Brocklehurst nodded. You have made a wise choice in schools, Mrs. Reed. Our pupils are quiet and wear plain clothes. Jane will be taught her proper place in life. He handed me a book of prayers, then left the house. I glared at my aunt. I am not a liar. I blurted out. If I were a liar, I'd say I loved you. But I do not love you. I hate you. I will never call you aunt again. My aunt looked frightened. Children's faults must be corrected, she said. Lying is not my fault. I cried out. Send me away to school soon, I hate living here. I will indeed, muttered my aunt. It took only a day or two to pack my few belongings. I left Gateshead Hall on a cold January morning. Bessie packed me some biscuits for the long trip. A coach pulled by 4 horses and filled with passengers drew up to the gate. I climbed on board, but not before I hugged and kissed Bessie goodbye. That was how I left Gateshead and headed for the unknown. Chapter 2. Lowood School. I remember little of the long journey to Lowood. As night approached, our coach headed into a wooded valley. A wild wind whistled around us. Soothed by the sound, I fell asleep. Suddenly the coach stopped. Is there a little girl called Jane Eyre here? A servant asked. I was handed down, and the coach rumbled away. The servant led me inside a large building. She left me alone in a parlor, warming my hands at a blazing fire. Agnignalod, the school superintendent, Miss Temple, soon entered the room. She was tall, with kind brown eyes. You must be tired, she said gently to me. Is this the first time you have left your parents, little girl? I explained that I had no parents. She asked me how old I was, my name, and if I could read, write, and sew. Then she sent me off to bed in a long dormitory lined with 30 or 40 beds. Surrounded by silence, I fell asleep. A loud bell woke me. It was still dark, but the girls all around me were getting out of bed and putting on handmade brown frocks. I dressed, shivering in the bitter cold. When the bell rang again, we marched downstairs to the dining room for breakfast. How glad I was! I felt sick from not eating. The room was huge and gloomy. Bowls of steaming porridge sat on 2 tables. The food smelled terrible. I saw some of the girls wrinkle their noses. Disgusting! The porridge is burned again, they murmured. "Au silence," shouted a teacher. After prayers and a hymn, the meal began. I was starving and quickly ate a few spoonfuls. But I soon realized how bad the cereal was. Each girl tasted her food and tried to swallow it. But no one could. When breakfast was over, we went to the schoolroom for our classes. 80 girls sat on benches, softly reciting their lessons. The older girls were taught geography and music. My class learned history, grammar, writing, and arithmetic. Baber? At noon, the bell rang, and Miss Temple stood up to make an announcement. She smiled. This morning, you could not eat the breakfast. You must be hungry. You will be served a lunch of bread and cheese. How good that food tasted! After lunch, each girl put on a straw bonnet and a cloak. We went out to the garden for exercise and play. A fog hung over the damp garden. The stronger girls ran about. But many girls were pale and thin. They stayed on the porch. I heard them coughing often. Does this house belong to Miss Temple? I asked one girl sitting nearby. Oh, no, she said with a sigh. We wish it did. She reports to Mr. Brocklehurst. He buys all of our food and the material we use to make our clothes. The bell called us to an early dinner of potatoes with shreds of rusty-looking meat. I wondered if every meal would taste this bad. More lessons followed. At 5 o'clock, we were each given half a slice of brown bread. After more studying, water and thin oatcakes were handed out. Then we went up to bed. The next few weeks were hard for me. Our plain dresses and aprons did not protect us from the winter weather. We had no boots, and snow got into our shoes and melted. And there was not enough food. I was hungry all the time. The bigger girls took food from the smaller ones. Many times I was left with only a morsel. One afternoon, Mr. Brocklehurst arrived in the schoolroom. Twice in the past 2 weeks, a lunch of bread and cheese was served to the girls. That is not in the rules. Who did this? And why? He demanded. Miss Temple stepped forward. I did, she confessed. The breakfast was badly cooked. No one could eat it. I could not let the girls wait until midday dinner. Mr. Brocklehurst shook his head angrily. I have a plan in bringing up these girls, he said. They must be patient and strong in spirit. How will they learn such things if they are fed treats? He looked around. I held up my chalk slate to hide my face. I remembered what Mrs. Reed had said to him about me. I didn't want him to see me. All at once, my slate slipped from my hand and crashed to the floor. Careless girl, said Mr. Brocklehurst. It is the new pupil, I see. Come forward. He made me stand on a high stool in the middle of the room. Children, began Mr. Brocklehurst. Do not play with this girl. Teachers, watch her carefully. For this child is a liar. She must stand for a half-hour on that stool. No one must speak to her for the rest of the day. Then he left the room. I almost began to sob. Then a student passed by and gave me a smile of friendship. I took a deep breath and held my head up high. Mr. Brocklehurst would not win. I would be stronger than anyone. As the months went by, I grew happier at school. Miss Temple was kind to me, and I made a few friends. My classes went well, too. I began to learn French and drawing. When warmer weather came, we took walks among the flowers and trees. But with the warm weather came sickness. A fever swept through Lowood School. Many students, weak from the harsh winter, fell ill. Some even died. And finally the illness in the school ended. But the townspeople were angry. They checked the school and saw how poorly we were fed and clothed. They discovered how cruel Mr. Brocklehurst had been. He knew people were put in charge. Things improved, and Lowood became a fine school. Stayed there for 6 years as a student. I worked hard and rose to be the top student in the highest class. After that, the school gave me a job as a teacher. I taught younger girls reading, writ-ing, sewing, drawing, and more. During my years at Lowood, Miss Temple guided me, first as my teacher, then as my friend. But after I had been there for 8 years, she married and moved far away. I grew tired of Lowood. What was keeping me there now? I wondered what lay beyond the school's gates. What kind of life could I make for myself? I decided to seek work as a governess, teaching children in a family. I placed an advertisement in the town's newspaper. After one long week, I heard from a Mrs. Fairfax at Thornfield Hall. She offered me a position. I told the school that I wished to take the job. But Mrs. Reed had to give me permission. I wrote her a letter. "You may do as you please," my aunt wrote back curtly. On my last night at Lowood, I packed my few clothes in a trunk, the same trunk I had arrived with 8 years earlier. Just then, I was told that a visitor wished to see me downstairs. A woman rushed out of the parlor. "You've not forgotten me, Miss Jane," she said. "Bessie! Bessie!" I cried happily, hugging her. It was Aunt Reed's maid. "When you wrote to your aunt, I decided to visit you before you went off on your new life," Bessie said. Then she grew quiet. "There's something I need to tell you, Mississippi. 7 years ago, a man came to Gateshead. He was looking for you. His last name was Eyre. Mrs. Reed said you were away at school. He could not stay, he was sailing to a foreign land. He looked like quite a gentleman. I believe he was your father's brother." I hesitated. I had an uncle, and he'd come looking for me. "So he left the house?" I finally asked. "Yes, and Mrs. Reed was rude to him. She always did say that the Eyres were poor and not to be trusted." I shook my head sadly. Would my uncle ever come looking for me again? The next day, I saw Bessie as we waited for our coaches. Bessie's coach took her back to Gateshead. And mine took me to a new life at Thornfield Hall. Chapter 3. A Curious Laugh. My journey to Thornfield took more than 17 hours. The October night was raw and misty. I had time to think as the one-horse coach rattled along. Did Mrs. Fairfax live alone with her little girl? I hope Mrs. Fairfax will not be like Mrs. Reed, I prayed. About 10 minutes after passing a church, we reached a set of gates in a wall. The driveway led to a large house, with candlelight and only one window. "Will you walk this way, ma'am?" asked a young maid at the front door. I followed her to a snug room. An elderly lady sat knitting by the fire. "How do you do, my dear?" she said kindly. "I am Mrs. Fairfax. Do sit down. Your luggage will be taken up to your room." She turned to the maid and said, "Leah, please bring us some sandwiches." She treats me like a visitor, not a governess, I thought, watching as Mrs. Fairfax served the food herself. "Shall I see Miss Fairfax tonight?" I asked politely. "Miss Fairfax?" "Oh, you mean Miss Varens, your pupil," Mrs. Fairfax replied. "She is not your daughter?" I asked, puzzled. "No, I have no family," Mrs. Fairfax explained. "I am so glad you have come. Thornfield can get quite lonely. We have Leah, and John, who drove you here, and his wife, the cook." She smiled and added, "Just last month little Adele Varens came to live here. She makes the house come alive. And now you are here, too." She then showed me to my room. We walked up a staircase made of dark oak. The long chilly hallway on the second floor looked as if it belonged in a church, not a house. I was pleased to find my new bedroom small and cozy. I fell asleep quickly and slept soundly all night. The next morning, I walked downstairs and out onto the lawn. The house was imposing, with battlements around the top. Loudly cawing crows flew above it. Mrs. Fairfax appeared at the door. "How do you like Thornfield?" she asked. I told her I liked it very much. "It is a pretty place," she agreed. "But it will get out of order unless Mr. Rochester comes to live here permanently or visits it more often." "Mr. Rochester?" I exclaimed. "Who is he?" "The owner of Thornfield," Mrs. Fairfax said. "You did not know that?" "I thought Thornfield belonged to you," I said. "To me? What an idea," she said, laughing. "I am only the housekeeper." "And the little girl my pupil?" "She is Mr. Rochester's ward. He asked me to find a governess for her." "Ah, here she comes with her nurse." Sophie, a delicate girl of 7 or 8, came running over. She had curls falling down to her waist, and a thin, pale face. "Box's bus, is this my governess?" Adele asked her nurse in French. Her nurse answered yes back in French. "Adele was born in France," Mrs. Fairfax explained to me. "When she first came here, she could speak no English at all. Now she speaks a little, but mixed with French." Luckily, I had studied French at Lowood and was able to chat with the girl during breakfast. Adele told me about the clean, pretty town where she had lived in France. "My mama is not alive anymore," Adele said. "She taught me to sing and dance. May I sing for you now?" After the little performance, I took her to the house's library. This would be our classroom. Mr. Rochester had left us many suitable books, a piano, an easel, and 2 globes. I taught Adele until noon, when I allowed her to return to Sophie. Mrs. Fairfax then showed me around the house. The dining room was beautiful and stately. It had a stained glass window and purple chairs and curtains. The drawing room was also lovely, with a flowered carpet and large mirrors. Everything was clean and tidy. "Mr. Rochester's visits are rare," Mrs. Fairfax said. "But they are always unexpected. So I keep the rooms ready for him. Would you like to see the rest?" What a tour I had! The large front bedrooms on the 2nd floor were grand-looking. Over the years, older beds and chests had been moved up to the 3rd floor. A long, narrow hallway separated the front and back rooms. It was lined with small black doors, all of them shut. I liked the hush and gloom that filled those darkened rooms. Tapestries hung on the heavy oak doors and walls. The servants have smaller rooms in the back. "No one ever sleeps here," Mrs. Fairfax said. "If there were a ghost at Thornfield, this would be its haunt." "You have no ghost, then?" I asked with a shiver. "None that I ever heard of," Mrs. Fairfax replied, smiling. "Come, I'll show you the view from the roof." I followed her up a narrow staircase to the attic. Then we climbed a ladder up through a trapdoor to the roof. I leaned over the battlements and viewed the ground spread out below, a velvet lawn, a field, dark woods, the country church, and a ring of hills. I could hardly see my way back down the ladder. The attic was so dark after the bright blue sky above. Mrs. Fairfax stayed behind to fasten the trapdoor. I groped my way down the narrow staircase to the 3rd floor. Then I heard something, the last sound I expected to hear in such a quiet place. A curious laugh. The ghostly sound stopped, then began again, louder this time. It seemed to echo in every room. "Mrs. Fairfax!" I called out. "Did you hear that laugh?" "Who is it?" "Some of the servants, very likely," she answered. "Perhaps Grace Poole. We use her for sewing and to help Leah with the housework." Grace sews in one of these rooms. Leah and she are often noisy together. The strange laugh sounded again, low and ending in an odd murmur. Grace, called Mrs. Fairfax. I did not really expect anyone to answer. But the door nearest me opened, and a servant came out. The woman was solidly built, with red hair and a hard, plain face. She did not look like a ghost at all. Too much noise, Grace, said Mrs. Fairfax. Remember the rules. Grace curtsied silently and went back into the room. And Mrs. Fairfax